The manor was quiet. Lloyd sat across from his father, picking at his food. He'd avoided this moment for as long as he could, but if the old man didn't approve his plans, things might get complicated. His father eyed him, suspicious as ever, and asked what he was scheming this time. Lloyd, keeping his voice steady, said he built the house because the landlord had already agreed to it in writing. But the man pressed further. What about the rest of the townspeople? Had they signed contracts too? Lloyd gave a casual nod and kept eating. His father sighed. They had a duty to protect their people, not trick them. He wouldn't tolerate abuse of trust. Lloyd told him not to worry. He was not planning to. He kept eating. It didn't matter what he did. People would still expect the worst. He stood up from the table. If there was nothing further, he would take his leave. But his father stopped him. Was this really about the family situation? He didn't need to get involved. Lloyd paused. He had heard those words before. Another life, another father. Back then, he had placed his trust in those words. Not this time. He told his father not to lose hope. He had no intention of doing so himself. As he left, one quiet thought stuck with him. He wished he'd said those words before too. As Lloyd walked through the manor, he mentally reviewed the contracts he'd secured so far, already thinking ahead to what needed to come next. That was when he spotted two unfamiliar men approaching from the other end of the corridor. They passed him without a glance. No bow, no greeting, nothing. Lloyd stopped. Guests of the house, and not even the courtesy to acknowledge the Lord's son. He glanced over his shoulder as they walked away. That couldn't be them, could it? He narrowed his eyes. Then it clicked. Those men, were they the ones from the story? The two men were now in his father's office, arguing with him. They demanded to know how much longer they'd be expected to wait. The agreed-upon date had already passed. One of them warned that if this dragged on any longer, they might have to take matters into their own hands. The other looked around the office and suggested selling some of the manor's belongings. Surely something here was worth a decent sum. From just outside, Lloyd leaned toward the slight gap in the door, a glint in his eye. Perfect. Right on time. He slipped away with a grin. Back in his room, Lloyd opened the RP system and stared at it. He wondered how exactly he was supposed to use it. As if on cue, the system chimed. A message appeared informing him he could invest his RP into abilities. Lloyd raised an eyebrow, so it actually did something useful for once. Usually it just mocked him. Another chime. This time, the system replied with a flat message. Forget it. Then, the interface blinked out entirely, like it had taken offence. Lloyd panicked and started apologising, begging the system to come back. Silence. Then, a loading circle appeared. The system seemed to be thinking it over. Without warning, a blue ring of light formed at his feet and swept upward, scanning his body. Text began scrolling in front of him. Skills detected. Soil mechanics, hydraulics, structural mechanics, water supply and sewage theory, steel structure design and concrete design, advanced design programming. The system chimed again, surprised that Lloyd was smarter than he looked. Lloyd snapped back, face twisted in offence, yelling that he had a degree, thank you very much. Another alert popped up. 2 skills were available for RP investment. Basic surveying, 15 RP. Basic design, 20 RP. Lloyd studied the options, thinking he had no idea what either one actually did. Still, he had the points. May as well try. He selected both. A sudden green glow burst from his body, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled to the window and threw it open. From his glowing eyes, projections shot out across the lawn, blueprints forming mid-air. Later, Lloyd was already experimenting with the new skills. A digital canvas floated in front of him as he traced building designs with a flick of his fingers. Much better than scribbling on paper. This would save a lot of time. Still, could Javier handle all the construction alone? Lloyd frowned deep in thought. It'd be a huge help if he could just summon some heavy machinery. He perked up. Seriously? The system began processing again. A new screen appeared. Random summon game. Lloyd raised an eyebrow. What was this? Gacha mechanics? He stared at the screen, half expecting it to be a trap to drain his RP. Another window popped up. Random summon, 50 RP. He sighed. He only had 1 point left. Still. What kind of summon could it be? Maybe something powerful, something useful. His eyes sharpened. If he wanted to find out, he'd need more RP. And to get that, he needed to raise his reputation with the key characters. We cut back to his father's office. The two men are growing impatient. The plump man leans forward with a sleazy grin and suggests that maybe they should start selling off the women tending to the Baroness, and, if it came to it, the Baroness herself. Lloyd's father stands up abruptly and shouts at him, demanding to know how he dares say such a thing. Then, a voice cuts in from behind the lender. Just because he lends money, does that give him the right to speak without manners? It's Lloyd. He stands right behind him, one hand casually draped over his shoulder. His gaze narrows as he looks down at him. The man jumps in shock, spinning around and demanding to know who he is. Arcos stares at Lloyd in disbelief, saying his name aloud. Recognition flashes across the lender's face. So he's the son with no manners. Makes sense. Only someone like that would barge into a meeting uninvited. Lloyd doesn't respond to the insult. Instead, he asks the man to show his warrant. The two men hesitate, clearly not understanding. Lloyd clarifies. He's invoking the Royal Family and Nobility Act, Article 3, Clause 6. As a noble, he has the right to protect the family's interests as vassals of the king, so unless they have a warrant, they're trespassing, which, by law, carries consequences. The two go pale. They claim they've never heard of such a law. Lloyd smiles coldly. Then they'll find out together. He calls through the half-open door. Javier steps inside, calm and composed. He gives Lloyd a respectful nod in greeting. Lloyd's grin twists. He gives the order. Cut off the trespasser's arm. Without hesitation, Javier begins to draw his sword. The lenders recoil, shouting in panic. One of them yells that this is madness, that they'll report him to the authorities. Lloyd asks them, who do they think the judge will believe? 2 loan sharks or a baron? Javier advances. The men scramble for the door, yelling that Lloyd will regret this. Lloyd only laughs as they flee. His father, still stunned, calls out to him. What did he just do? They can't pay what the men want. Now it's going to get worse. Lloyd walks over to the desk and drops the sack he'd been holding. It hits the wood with a heavy clank. He explains. He was planning to hand it over after collecting payment from all the orders. It should be enough to cover most of this month's debt. Arcos stares at the bag, then at Lloyd. His voice is tense. Is Lloyd swindling the townsfolk? Before Lloyd can answer, Javier speaks up. He assures Arcos that Lloyd has not extorted anyone, and that he'll personally see to it that Lloyd keeps every promise he made. Lloyd looks at his father's face. He sees it clearly. He trusts Javier. Lloyd bows, then tells his father he will take his leave. The two of them were now walking back from his father's office. Javier glanced at Lloyd and asked how he knew about that law regarding trespassers. Lloyd sidestepped the question, saying he must have read it somewhere once. In truth, he'd learned it from Javier. Back when he read the book, right after his parents passed, the loan sharks had gone so far as to try digging up their bodies to sell them. Javier hadn't hesitated. That was when he'd recited the law, word for word, then turned and took both their heads off in a single sweep. Later, Javier had stood before a judge and been found not guilty. Lloyd thought to himself, knowing this story was going to be useful. He figured a pop-up should be coming any second now. Right on cue, a chime rang out. A screen appeared in front of him. Reputation with Baron Frontera increased by 6. 60 RP earned. A wide grin spread across his face. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. Now he had enough to do the summon. Later that night, Lloyd made his way to a quiet spot on the estate. He looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching. Then he asked the system to start the summon game. A screen appeared, and he pressed start. A flash of light lit up the area. Digital cogs spun into place in front of him, growing more intricate by the second. He stared, mouth slightly open. Was this a magic circle? It looked dramatic. Cogs spinning, light flaring, gears grinding loudly, until he realised the magic circle itself was tiny, no larger than the palm of his hand. All this noise, for that. He frowned. It really was over the top for something so small. Then suddenly everything went silent, until a whoosh erupted from the circle. A creature burst out, head first, and landed on the ground with a soft thud. It looked up at Lloyd with bright eyes, clearly thrilled to see him. Lloyd, towering over it, scowled. All that for this? The creature's expression fell. Tears welled up in its eyes, devastated by the rejection. Lloyd turned to leave, disappointed, but behind him, the creature cried out, trying desperately to get his attention. Lloyd glanced back, confused. It seemed like it was trying to say something. He narrowed his eyes. It was trying to convince him it could be useful. He waved it off. What could it possibly do? The creature begged him to give it a chance. Lloyd crossed his arms. Show me then, he said, unconvinced. The creature fidgeted, then seemed to chew something. It spat out 2 damp, crumpled papers which landed with a soft plop at his feet. Lloyd crouched down and picked them up, frowning at the mess. He unfolded the soggy papers. It was some kind of user manual. Pudong is an adorable hamster. Please give it lots of love. Feed it the enclosed seeds and it will change size. He looked at the small packet of seeds and poured them into his hand. The manual continued. The red seed makes Podong grow large. Duration, 12 hours. The blue seed shrinks it back to normal. Additional seeds can be purchased for just 1 RP. Lloyd glanced down at the creature. Just how big can you get? Podong squeaked something unclear, but Lloyd somehow got the message. See for yourself. He considered it. Hamsters were good at digging, weren't they? If it got close to his size, it might actually be useful. He fed Podong the red seed. Immediately, a pulse of energy surged from the creature. Lloyd, still crouching, was thrown backward by the blast of its sudden growth. He landed with a grunt, then looked up. His mouth dropped, eyes wide. 30 feet tall. Podong towered over him, a smug grin on its face. A chime rang out. A screen appeared. Podong has learned skill, level 1 digging. Podong demonstrated immediately, burrowing into the ground with impressive speed and ease. Another alert, skill unlocked, level 2, packing dirt. The hamster rolled across the soil, compressing the loose earth beneath it like a steamroller. Then a third alert, skill unlocked, cheek pockets. Podong waddled over, cheeks bulging. It stopped in front of Lloyd and, splat, dropped a massive boulder at his feet, saliva trailing behind it like a wave. Lloyd was drenched, but he didn't care. He stared up at the giant hamster, soaked in drool, but grinning wide. These skills... This thing really was like having heavy machinery. As he walked back, Lloyd wondered how he was going to explain having a giant hamster all of a sudden. People might get suspicious. He smirked. He'd just carry around a tome and pretend to be a summoner, he thought. Then his thoughts shifted. He needed to sort out the labour for all the projects he had lined up. After some time, we cut back to Lloyd. He was now out in the countryside, addressing a group of men. He stood like a foreman, calling out that safety came first. The men, soldiers under the Baron's command, stood around looking confused, unsure why they were even there. Lloyd looked irritated. These guys were just a bunch of lazy bums in the book. He still didn't understand why the Baron kept them on. But he grinned. At least now he could put them to work and make them earn their pay. He shouted for them to listen up. Just because they were soldiers didn't mean they were exempt from labour. He thought back to his own time in the army. He'd spent more time digging holes and pulling weeds than doing anything heroic. He pointed at a pile of clay nearby and told them he'd dug it up himself the night before. Well, technically that had been Podong. But they didn't need to know that. He kept going, raising his voice. The estate was growing, and he needed their help to move that clay and support construction in the nearby village. The soldiers didn't look thrilled. He wasn't surprised. Someone approached from behind him. Lloyd turned his head. A man stood there, in one he recognised immediately. It was the senior knight, Lord Neumann. He asks Lloyd what he's doing with his men. Lloyd grins. Just as expected. Here he is. He knew Neumann would have a problem with this. There were 3 knights serving under the Baron. At the top was Neumann, then Bayern beneath him, and last in the pecking order, Javier. In the book, when the estate fell, Javier and Bayern had stayed loyal until the very end. But this guy, he was the first to jump ship and run. Lloyd knew Neumann had been selling information about the Baron to the con men, and that didn't sit right with him, especially not from the estate's highest-ranking knight. Lloyd turned to Neumann. What did it look like he was doing? Neumann, unimpressed, told him this was no place for a soldier, and he wouldn't tolerate it. Lloyd hunched over, resting his arms on his spade with an unamused look. In truth, he thought Neumann was only angry because this little work detail was disrupting his shady dealings with the loan sharks. He told Neumann he had his father's permission. Neumann shot back that he must have tricked the Baron, because anything Lloyd did was for personal gain. Lloyd shrugged. That sounded about right. But to insult the Baron's son? Did he want a pummeling? Neumann's blood boiled, his mouth clenched. Veins popped at the edge of his forehead. Lloyd thought his ego was so fragile he wouldn't last a minute gaming online. He slammed his shovel into the ground and grinned. Time to press a few buttons. Then he flung a shovelful of dirt straight at Neumann. The men around them were in shock. Neumann struggled to keep himself together, shouting that Lloyd was a scoundrel for daring to insult a knight's honour. He told Lloyd he was nothing. And he'd be even less once the estate fell. Lloyd cupped his ear, mocking him, then called out for him to put their ranks aside and settle it directly. He spun the shovel once in his hand, then pointed it at Neumann. "Let's have a duel," he said, full of confidence. Neumann stared in disbelief. He told Lloyd he'd regret this. Back at the manor, Lloyd was talking to Javier about what happened with Neumann. Javier informed him that the duel had been scheduled. It would take place in 1 month's time. He looked to Lloyd with a hint of concern and asked if he really thought he could win. Lloyd, leaning back against the bed, scoffed. Of course not. The guy was a knight, an expert swordsman. Lloyd, just a nobody. The son of a baron with no real combat skills. He taunted Javier, asking if he was stupid for even thinking he stood a chance. Javier's blood boiled. His hand went to his sword, but he stopped himself. Something wasn't right. He threw dirt at Sir Neumann, then challenged him to a duel. At first, Javier had assumed Lloyd was just being a fool again, but now he wasn't so sure. He even assigned Bayern to supervise the soldiers, like this had all been planned from the start, and now he was acting like he had no chance of winning. It was almost coordinated. That meant either Lloyd was bluffing, or worse, scheming. He looked over at him again, only to see Lloyd holding a booger on the tip of his finger. Disgusted, Javier thought how filthy he was. He wished he could just cut him down where he stood. Lloyd, now casually wiping the booger off his hand, told Javier he had a task for him. He grinned and asked him to teach him how to use a sword. Javier's eyes narrowed, unamused. He flatly refused. Lloyd groaned. Why not? Javier gave him 2 reasons. First, his job was to make sure Lloyd didn't go around wreaking havoc in town. Second, if he taught a scumbag like Lloyd to fight, all it would do was put more innocent lives in danger. He took offence. In protest, he reminded Javier that he was a gentleman, and he shouldn't talk like that to his employer. Leaning in with a grin, he asked if that was really his final answer. He wouldn't teach him, not even if it meant he could cure his insomnia. Javier froze, trying to keep his cool. How did he know about that? Lloyd leaned back, still smiling. It was all in the book. He even knew the cause of Javier's insomnia. In the Night of Blood and Iron, knights were ranked by sword level. From the bottom, low-level sword expert, mid-level, high-level, and finally, swordmaster. Javier was already high-level, and just on the verge of becoming a master. His senses were sharpening, nearing superhuman levels, and he couldn't fully control them yet. That was the cause. One of the side effects of evolving as a swordsman. Not that Javier would ever figure that out on his own. out here in the sticks. He tilted his head, asked if they had a deal or not, and told him to stop pretending. He could read him like a book. Javier sighed. After a pause, he agreed to at least try. Lloyd beamed and told him he couldn't back out now. Javier smirked. Of course. He already knew Lloyd was going to fail. He'd tried everything. There was no way he could cure his insomnia. Sometime later, Javier was sitting in a rocking chair, fast asleep, snoring gently like a baby. Lloyd stood over him, arms crossed, laughing to himself. He knew him too well. In the book, the first time Javier ever dozed off was when he heard someone reciting a magic spell. So what did he do? He'd pulled out one of his old textbooks, something long and dull about reinforcing concrete, enough to put anyone out cold. And just like magic, here they were. Grinning like a maniac, he thought to himself, now your swordsmanship is mine. The next day, a refreshed-looking Javier stood in the training pit, watching as Lloyd arrived. He told him to start with 50 laps around the perimeter. Lloyd was not amused. He hesitated, then started running as Javier watched in silence. After just one lap, Lloyd came back around and told Javier he didn't like exercising and demanded to learn some sword skills instead. Javier ignored him. Lloyd huffed and continued on for another lap. When he came around again, he pointed at Javier and said he saw through his game. He figured Javier thought he'd give up if he made it hard enough. Another lap passed. Lloyd kept going, picking up the thread of his argument as he ran. He said Javier probably couldn't wait to tell him he didn't have what it takes. Javier flinched slightly. Lloyd noticed and grinned. Gotcha. He kept going, now wearing a proud smile, and called out, asking what Javier was going to do once he finished all the running. As he pushed forward, a familiar chime rang out. A screen appeared in front of him, alerting him that his passive skill, Annoying Brat, had increased to level 4. He stared up at it, face twisting in frustration, and shouted at the system to stop making up random skills. Now panting from the effort, Lloyd thought to himself, this wasn't easy, but life wasn't so bad. Back in Korea, he had lived in a tiny room. No family. By day, he carried bricks up 4 floors to a rooftop. By night, he loaded and unloaded delivery trucks. It was a desperate routine, just to stay off the streets to avoid starving. The future had always looked bleak. No matter how hard he worked, nothing ever changed. But now, there was something just barely within reach. Compared to before, this pain was nothing. By the time the sun had set, Lloyd was still running. Javier stood in the same spot, quietly watching him. He had to admit it. If Lloyd was working this hard, maybe he did deserve a shot at learning sword techniques. A notification popped up in front of Lloyd. Approval rating with Javier has increased by 1 point. Current standing, -28. 18 RP gained. Back at the manor, Lloyd's father sat in his study, speaking with Neumann. He told the knight he was disappointed, deeply dismayed that Lloyd would show such disrespect towards someone who had served their family for so long. He had thought Lloyd had changed his ways. Apparently, he'd been mistaken. But even so, the duel would go ahead. After what happened, Lloyd had no right to be shielded from the consequences. He only asked one thing, not to hurt him too badly. He was still his heir. Just knock some sense into him. Neumann bowed in acknowledgement, but as he turned to leave, darker thoughts filled his mind. Duels didn't always go smoothly. Accidents happened all the time, and if the Baron got in the way, he'd kill him too. The Baroness as well. It wouldn't be hard to stage something that looked like an unfortunate incident. He was going to leave eventually anyway. As soon as he made enough coin selling secrets, he'd be gone from this backwater village and off somewhere better. Thanks to that idiot's son, things had simply moved up ahead of schedule. If the duel went as planned, Lloyd would be dead, and if anyone tried to interfere, they'd join him. Then he'd take what he could and disappear, just as he always intended. 1 month later, the day had arrived. Lloyd and Neumann stood in the training ring, a wide circle of packed dirt surrounded by an eager crowd. Word of the duel had spread, and everyone, from estate staff to townsfolk, had gathered to watch. Lloyd's father and mother sat on a platform, unease written clearly on their faces. Behind them stood Javier and Bayan, both silent. Newman stood with practised calm, sword in hand. His posture was polished, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. He addressed Lloyd with feigned respect, asking if he was ready. Lloyd walked to the centre of the ring, dragging his shovel along the ground. As he reached his mark, he kicked the scoop upward, caught the handle mid-air, and rested it on his shoulder. A small grin tugged at his face. He said he was ready. Ready to knock his lights out.